For quite some time, there has been an increasing number of Catholics who claim that Pope Francis and Pope Leo are in error regarding their teaching on the death penalty. When I first learned of the changes to the Catechism on capital punishment, along with Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, I was adamantly opposed. I believed that Pope Francis contradicted the tradition of the Church. I argued that one does not have to give assent to Pope Francis's magisterial teaching on the death penalty if it contradicts higher magisterial authority. And since I believed that it did contradict the higher magisterial teachings of the preconciliar Church, I could withhold my assent and remain in good conscience. But then, I came to discover that it wasn't Pope Francis who contradicted the tradition of the Church on this issue. It was I who contradicted the Church. I wanted to make this video to show why I was wrong, and why the Holy Father was right. My hope is that if you, the viewer, are genuinely struggling with this teaching, this video can help explain some of the philosophical and theological reasons behind the Pope's view. Earlier, I introduced my previous line of thinking. Pope Francis's teaching contradicts higher magisterial teachings. Therefore, I can disregard it in good conscience. But my view held a hidden presupposition, that Pope Francis's teaching contradicts that of his predecessors. Here I will demonstrate that if one holds the view that Pope Francis's teaching, properly understood, contradicts his predecessors, then one is actually rejecting the traditional and scholastic presuppositions that justify the death penalty. First, we have to consider what Pope Francis cannot mean. He cannot mean that the death penalty is intrinsically evil, that is, that there has never been a right time to administer it. This is proven in Fratelli Tutti itself, where he approvingly summarizes St. John Paul II. Here he writes, St. John Paul II stated clearly and firmly that the death penalty is inadequate from a moral standpoint and no longer necessary from that of penal justice. Now, if it is no longer necessary, then it once was necessary. If it once was necessary, then it is not intrinsically evil. Nor is the death penalty intrinsically good. This is proven by the fact that one can be unjustly sentenced to death. This point is not controversial. So already then, it necessarily follows that Pope Francis does not contradict his predecessors. Aristotle states in chapter 7 of On Interpretation that a contradiction requires that a statement be denied. If the traditional teaching is the death penalty can be justified, the contradictory is the death penalty can never be justified. But Pope Francis explicitly rejects this in Fratelli Tutti, as we just saw. So Pope Francis and Pope Leo do not contradict their predecessors. To accuse them of contradicting the tradition implies a misunderstanding of what the term contradiction means. But not only does Pope Francis avoid contradicting his predecessors, he actually upholds the very scholastic philosophy that justifies the death penalty. For we only need to consider, from a practical and prudential standpoint, whether our current magistrate can administer the death penalty in a way that doesn't imply vengeance. Advocates for the death penalty claim that retribution is necessary for justice. And this is true. Retribution is necessary for justice. But retribution is merely a necessary condition for justice. It is not a sufficient condition. This is proven by the fact that even vengeance is retributive. But obviously vengeance is not justice. So not only is the purpose of punishment retributive, but it must also be medicinal for the criminal. This is first shown by Plato in his work The Gorgias. Here he argues that it is worse to do injustice than to suffer injustice. And this is found in line 475a onward, where he's building on that argument. Aristotle builds on what Plato says here in Book 5, Chapter 11 of the Ethics. Here, Aristotle writes, "But still, acting unjustly is the worse, for it involves vice and is blameworthy. Involves vice which is either of the complete and unqualified kind, or almost so. We must admit the latter alternative, because not all voluntary unjust action implies injustice as a state of character, while being unjustly treated does not involve vice and injustice in oneself. In itself, then, being unjustly treated is less bad, but there is nothing to prevent its being incidentally a greater evil." So in short, Plato and Aristotle hold that it is worse to do injustice than to suffer injustice, because while the latter may damage the body, when we suffer injustice, our bodies are damaged, the former damages our soul. So what are we to do with the unjust man? We punish him. Why? Not to get even or have him merely give back what is owed. We punish him to help him. We punish him for the sake of his own soul. If disease is sickness to the body, then vice and injustice are sickness to the soul. This is why Aristotle says regarding punishment in Book 3, Chapter 3 of the Ethics. Again, if the virtues are concerned with actions and passions, and every passion and every action is accompanied by pleasure and pain, for this reason also virtue will be concerned with pleasures and pains. This is indicated also by the fact that punishment is inflicted by these means. For it, punishment, is a kind of cure, and it is the nature of cures to be affected by contraries. So just punishment, then, must not merely be retributive, it must also be medicinal. Now, this medicinal understanding of justice is not a merely philosophical position. It is deeply rooted in the fathers of the Church. The great Saint Augustine echoes the same sentiment. During the trial of the murders of two priests, the same saint, let me backtrack. It's the trial of the murderers of two priests. So two murderers were put on trial. The same saint who permitted the use of the death penalty in Book 1 of the City of God, right? Because St. Augustine does not in principle take issue with the death penalty. But the same saint who permitted the use of the death penalty in Book 1 of his City of God was the same one who urged the judge not to take the life of the murderers. Here in his letter or epistle 133, he writes, "Wherefore I write this letter to implore you, by your faith in Christ, and by the mercy of Christ the Lord himself, by no means to do this or permit it to be done," to put the murderers to death through capital punishment. "For although we might silently pass over the execution of criminals who may be regarded as brought up for trial not upon an accusation of ours, but by an indictment presented by those to whose vigilance the preservation of the public peace is entrusted, we do not wish to have the sufferings of the servants of God avenged by the infliction of precisely similar injuries in the way of retaliation. Not, of course, that we object to the removal of these wicked men of the liberty to perpetrate further crimes, but our desire is rather that justice be satisfied without the taking of their lives or the maiming of their bodies in any part, and that by such coercive measures as may be in accordance with the laws, they be turned from their insane frenzy to the quietness of men in their sound judgment, or compelled to give up mischievous violence and betake themselves to some useful labor. This is indeed called a penal sentence. But who does not see that when a restraint is put upon the boldness of savage violence, and the remedies fitted to produce repentance are not withdrawn, this discipline should be called a benefit rather than vindicative punishment? Fulfill, Christian judge, the duty of an affectionate father. Let your indignation against their crimes be tempered by considerations of humanity. Be not provoked by the atrocity of their sinful deeds to gratify the passion of revenge, but rather be moved by the wounds which these deeds have inflicted on their own souls to exercise a desire to heal them. And that again is from St. Augustine, letter 133. So Augustine too then understands that just punishment must be medicinal and not merely retributive. It is actually for this reason that the Catechism of the Catholic Church states in paragraph 2266 that punishment, in addition to preserving public order and the safety of persons, has a medicinal scope. As far as possible, it should contribute to the correction of the offender. So on this matter then, both faith and reason agree. But does our contemporary political climate agree? And the answer is no. The modern state does not have this medicinal end in mind. It makes punishment no different than vengeance. So even though the death penalty is not intrinsically wrong in principle, and can, in principle, be justly applied, our current magistrate lacks the conditions necessary for implementing it correctly. Furthermore, the modern magistrate lacks a Catholic and scholastic worldview. So if we hold that the death penalty is admissible, given our current magistrate, then we imply that one does not need a Catholic and scholastic epistemological, metaphysical, or ethical set of presuppositions that coherently accounts for the legitimacy of the death penalty. So the very denial then of Pope Francis's view of the death penalty is actually a denial of the Catholic and scholastic preconditions that makes its intelligibility possible. It amounts to Enlightenment Kantian morality rather than Catholic morality. For under Kant's view, in his Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, prudence is unnecessary, it's not necessary, when establishing certitude and moral judgments, because prudence is concerned with practical affairs, with changing affairs. So the fact that I held in my past that Pope Francis contradicted the tradition of the Church implied really two things. First, that I did not know basic philosophy, like an understanding of what contradiction is, but also that in the name of scholasticism, I was actually championing modernism through Kantian Enlightenment ethics. So while I was merely parroting the scholastics, Pope Francis was imitating their hearts and minds. This is why Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti quoted the very verse that I would use to support the death penalty against me. We are all aware of Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for man is made in the image and likeness of God. I interpreted Genesis 9:6 shallowly. I understood it to mean that if you kill someone, then you deserve the death penalty, because you killed someone with dignity. And this interpretation is true, but it is shallow. I understood it as an American, but Pope Francis understood it as a Christian. He understood it as a type pointing to Christ. Whoever sheds the blood of man, and that's all of us, because we are guilty of the murder of Christ by our own sins, then by man, that is, by Christ, shall his blood be shed. Christ will shed his blood for us. Why? Because we are made in the image and likeness of God. So does the magistrate then bear the sword in vain? No. This is clear from St. Paul in Romans 13. But the fact that he does not bear the sword in vain does not mean that the sword is to be utilized in every case. And since our current magistrate does not consider punishment medicinally, that is, in the light of the dignity of the criminal, we are not in a position to say that the death penalty is admissible in our current political climate. So for this reason, I say, may God forgive me for all the times I've spoken ill of the Holy Father and rashly opposed him on this issue. I hope this was helpful. God bless.